Again, welcome. Thank you everyone who's joining live today for tuning in. And if you're watching the replay, I hope that you get a lot out of this session. This is a guest webinar for the course Writing for Digital Spaces, and I'm very glad to bring my online friend, Meg Nanson, here today to talk to us about all things SEO and content strategy. So here's the agenda, what we'll be doing the rest of the time today. We'll spend a little time on brief introductions, so you get to know us a little bit, we get to know who's all here today. Then we will move on to talk about Meg's journey as a professional writer. And then from there, we will launch into Q&A segments on different areas. So many of you submitted some fantastic questions. I'm going to be asking those aloud on your behalf today. But please know, if there's something that emerges in today's discussion and you think of an additional question, feel free to pop it into the chat. You'll see the chat in the bottom center of your Zoom window, and you can message everyone. I'll have a little bit of a slide on that coming up next. The rest of our agenda, we'll go through those other Q&A segments, and then we'll save the last 10 minutes for closing comments, additional resources, and just some extra time to chat informally off the record. So I'll stop the recording at the end. So a little bit of ground rules for this webinar. We are still... I should probably move that down to speak. Even though I feel like I live in Zoom sometimes, I still make mistakes. So I'm glad that I'm in good form for this part. This is important. Ground rules to make sure that we all have a smooth experience for this webinar. As I mentioned earlier, video on or off is your choice. Try to close anything that you don't need because, well, this is a digital space, and I know that you are bound to find many, many distractions. So for my part, I made sure to close my email, my calendar, any messaging apps, because I don't want anything distracting me during this session. I also mentioned before I press the record button that the session is recorded for members of the NYU community. And please do continue to ask questions to everyone in the chat as we go through our presentation. While for the most part, we'll be spending our time today in slides and I'm screen sharing them right now, I really like to pull back the curtain and pull us back into gallery view. So if this is new to you, now that I have stopped the screen sharing, in the top right of your Zoom window, you should see a little icon. It'll either say speaker view or gallery view. And if you click on it, what you want to look for is that Brady Bunch gallery view effect so that you can see the people who are here today. And if you'd like, sweaty from a run or not, feel free to briefly turn on your video or not and wave hello. And I will get us started with my own introduction. So I'm Clea Mahoney. I work at NYU in teaching and learning with technology, and I'm also an adjunct instructor in the Masters of Professional Writing program. Let me see what else. So enough about me though. I really want to share a little bit of how I met Meg. My course that I'm teaching this semester is called Writing for Digital Spaces, and I actually met Meg in one of my first ever digital spaces. I don't know if anyone remembers the magazine Shape, but back in, oh gosh, I don't even know, like 2004-ish, they had an online forum, and Meg and I met each other there through messaging. We were young and naive, and we shared far too much about our personal lives in an open forum back then, but it really, that was the start of my journey as a writer, as someone who really prefers to communicate in writing, because you can see I'm fumbling a little bit right now. But I'm so glad that, Meg and I have maintained that connection over the years. And I'm really excited to bring her into this course because, the course covers SEO and content marketing and content strategy. And that's not my day job. So I really wanted to bring in an expert to talk to you about, real life in the field in doing this work. So go ahead, Meg, and tell us a little bit about yourself, and then I'll take us back into screen sharing.
Yeah, so my name's Meg, and I'm currently an SEO and content strategist for a digital marketing agency called Grow with Studio. So I've been in this field for the past 10 years now, and kind of fell into things accidentally, but found that it was a really, really good outlet for my writing. I've worked in both in-house and agency settings. So an in-house SEO specialist just works on SEO for that particular company. And then an agency specialist has tons of clients. And so I've really appreciated like getting to work in the agency settings in particular, because you just run into so many different types of businesses and so many scenarios, and you watch what successful companies look like, and you watch what unsuccessful ones are, and you start to, you know, kind of pick up on these patterns. And it's been a really, really cool experience. I feel like I get to work in like 100 different industries at once. So yeah.
Thanks so much, Meg.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I'm sharing now is a slide, and these slides will be shared with you after the session. I'll make sure to email them to everyone. But when I asked Meg to reflect upon her journey as a professional writer, well, honestly, I was kind of hoping for something like this. On the right, like it's not a straight and narrow path. So tell us more. Walk us through what's going on this screen here, Meg.
Yeah. Yeah. She asked me to like make a slide, and I was like, oh, make this eyesore. But so basically I just kind of wanted to talk about my journey into this field as a writer, as someone who I mean, almost out of the womb, I was like passionately writing stuff. I think I wrote my first like full essay when I was 5 years old. And I had this idea like growing up, because of what had been kind of drilled into me academically, that, you know, I could follow this path, and like, and I ended up getting a poetry scholarship to Smith College. And I had this idea that would be it, like, because I went to a good school and I had these good grades, like I'd graduate and find some kind of writing job. I didn't even know what, and then eventually like publish my book and be an author. So that's not what happened at all. I actually, when I graduated right into a recession, and probably sent like a good like 300 resumes just like out into the ether, into the void, and had to really go through a process of like of humbling myself and rediscovering what it meant to me to both be a writer and also, you know, pay the bills. And yeah, that happened to a lot of people who graduated in 2008, and, you know, might happen again soon here. So I ended up falling into the world of SEO because I started to, a friend of mine from school hired me to write for her company's blog. And then from there, it became pretty clear that SEO was a valuable skill for bloggers to have. So I started learning more about it, and ultimately fell into the tech industry. I moved to Austin, Texas, because there were more jobs out there at the time. And I ultimately fell into the tech industry and started doing SEO in that world, and then just grew my knowledge like deeper and deeper. And I would say like the first like 5 years of my career, I had some like existential questions about that, where I was like, well, you know, like I'm writing about like garage door openers. Is this really what I wanted to do? But in the past 5 years, I've actually become really, really happy with it, because it lets me express my creativity, and I get to treat it as practice, really. Like I get to treat it as like my own personal gym, and just go in there and like do the best that I can, so that I can learn. And yeah, so it's been really fun. It's not at all what I expected or where I expected to be, but that's a good thing.
Wonderful. And thank you so much, Meg, for sharing that. I think, I have similar experiences. Where I am now is never really where I expected to be, but I love it. I love what I'm doing. And I think you shared some important ideas about, opportunities to practice and to
Mhm.
continually refine our craft as writers.
Yes.
So I'm going to switch us over to the first topic, and I do have some time estimates on the slide just to keep myself on track. I'm going to ask questions that folks submitted when they registered for this session, but please do ask your own questions, specifically right now on the topic of SEO in the chat, so that if we have time for those, we will make sure to capture them. All right, so Meg, my first question for you is, how can I apply SEO to social media apps?
Okay. So, I guess before I answer this, and this is something I should have asked you earlier, Clea, sorry, but
All good.
what is like the basic knowledge level here of SEO? Should I go over like a real basic explanation, or are people up to speed on that?
Oh, you know what? That is a really good question, and it's something that I try to do at the start of every, webinar or training session that I do. But yeah, why don't we all take a moment to share in the chat what is your baseline experience with SEO? If you're brand new to it, you can write something like newbie. If you have a little bit more experience, you can write that. Or you can do it, on a scale of 1 to 5. Brand new. Okay, so I'm seeing some people are looking for a primer, brand new. Yeah, tell us, please define the term for us, Meg.
Sure. So SEO stands for search engine optimization, and it's basically the process of helping pages get indexed and ranked for the searches that people are making that relate to that page. So that that the easiest way to like get grounded in SEO as a concept is to kind of go back to the beginning and think about Google as a business and Google's goals as a business. So Google's revenue model is almost entirely ads. That's how they make their money. They sell ads, and the reason that that is so lucrative for them is because they happen to sell ads on the most active search engine in the world. I think the last statistic I read was like 3 trillion searches a day. People go to Google for that. So if they couldn't make a search engine that people actually wanted to use, they would not be able to charge for the primo real estate for those advertisements, which by the way, the ads are, if you just Google anything and go to the search results, the ads are always going to say sponsored, and they're always going to be at the very top. And then you start the organic listings. So under the ads, those organic listings, that's what I do. I make sure that websites can get into those for the terms that they want to rank for. The ads you can pay for, the organic listings, you can't, because again, like Google wants to provide the best possible experience to its users. So like when someone Googles a search term, like it wants to provide the page that is the most relevant, the most useful, the one that's like really going to answer the search intent, the user's search intent. And so if they were just allowing people to like game the system, which is what people used to do in SEO, then they'd be serving pages that like nobody wants to read, and then nobody would use Google. So because Google's job is to serve the most useful and the best pages for people who make these searches, my job as an SEO specialist is basically to there are 2 parts to it. One is technical, which is like, I just need to take care of these technical things that'll get the site crawled and into Google's index, which an index is basically like a gigantic library card catalog. It's literally an index of like all of the content that exists, that has been, if you know index content, then you're not in the index. But so my job is like partially technical to get the website in there And then most of it is just like about making sure that the page is good, making sure the page is relevant, the content is great, the site is fast, because people leave if, I think the statistic is like after 3 seconds of load time, half your visitors leave. And so it's really taking care of all of these different usability and technical considerations to make a page a good fit with a keyword search, and a page that people want. And when you do that, that helps Google trust that the page is a good one to serve for that search. The other major part of SEO, that's all kind of the on-site stuff. The other major part is off-site, and that basically involves reaching out to different media sites and blogs and publications and other high authority sites, and getting them to talk about you and mention your website or your page, because Google can't, you know, all Google can do is figure out like the most objective measures it can for this subjective experience of enjoying something. And so they've determined that like a really good objective measure of how useful and enjoyable a page is like how many people are sharing it, how many people trust it, and how many relevant and like high authority people trust it. So put that all together and you kind of get like this whole menu of strategies that are very, very similar to traditional marketing strategies. And then you kind of tailor the strategies to fit the website based on what it needs. So that's SEO in a nutshell. And I can always write a blog post or something like helping explain this a little bit better, but that's sort of the that's the overview.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think that, some of these further questions might help to contextualize that even further.
For sure.
But yes, it is about more than just keywords, even though like keywords are a core strategy of it.
Mm-hmm.
So let's go back to that first question. How can I apply SEO to social media apps? And how I'm interpreting this question is, beyond making things findable on Google, how do we leverage social media to get our brand or our content more findable?
Yeah, so there are actually kind of, there are two ways to answer this question, because we can talk about social media links and their impact on Google's search results, or there are also on each individual social media platform like Instagram and Facebook, they actually have their own internal search algorithms. So there's like a different strategy completely for getting posts to rank well on social media. But I'll talk first about social media and its relationship to the broader picture of SEO, because there's actually a lot of confusion in even in my industry, like by professionals. They're like, so do social links like make a difference? Do they help your rankings? And the short answer is not directly. They really don't have much to do with rankings, but the longer answer is that brand mentions do. So basically, Google, they used to like not even count social media links at all as anything that was important for a website. But then they started to realize like, okay, this is here to stay, and it is a good measure of something. We don't want to consider these links to be like as weighty or powerful as links from blogs or websites. So what do we do with this? So they started tracking mentions, which is anytime someone talks about your brand, even if they're not linking to it, if they just mention it on social media, those like aggregated, and it's about the aggregate. It's like one mention's not really going to make a difference, but like those mentions over time are what Google wants to see, that people trust you and are talking about your site. So that's the relationship between having a social presence and ranking on Google. And then when you get into, like, let's say we're talking about Instagram, all of the social platforms have their own internal search engine. And so the way that you rank on something like Instagram and Facebook is a little bit different from how you'd rank on Google. It's actually a lot simpler. And basically, as a universal rule, like Facebook, Google, Pinterest, really any of them, they want to see that people are interested and engaged. So the more engagement that your post has, the more they'll start sharing it with other people. And it becomes kind of a cyclical feedback loop. And so a large part of ranking on any of the social platforms is to just try to create like the best, most shareable content that you can. And then try to build up your followers so that people are actually able to engage with it.
Awesome. That is super helpful. Thank you so much, Meg.
Mhm.
Okay, so I have a few kind of related questions, so I might ask them all in a row, and then you can kind of pick out what you want to talk about. Um, so these are all about SEO terms. The first question is, can SEO terms be updated over time? We have a
Mhm.
related question here, which is, I've heard that you can bury words in white on white backgrounds, and this helps your SEO. Is
Mhm.
that right? Which reminds me of like a terrible practice that the marketing folks and myself to some degree back at that first job I had in heating and cooling. Yeah, we did that.
Yeah.
But is it a good thing or a bad thing? And then kind of a related question to that, how many times should you repeat your main keywords in a blog to improve rankings? So I think that's why sometimes folks hide that as like white text against white backgrounds. Like maybe if I mention social media 25 billion times on this page, it's going to make me number one on Google. Can you help us unpack some of the myths and best and worst practices around that?
Yes, definitely. So I'm going to start at the top and just share what a keyword is. So a keyword is it's usually not a single word. It's almost never a single word. It's a search phrase. So if I'm doing SEO for a website that sells running shoes, maybe an SEO keyword might be like men's running shoes for wide feet. I probably wouldn't tackle the keyword men's running shoes because that is going to be super, super high competition. So there is a process in SEO that basically starts like toward the beginning of any strategy, and it's called keyword research. And you use a series of tools to dig into the search volume that different search phrases have, the competition, how hard it is to rank, who else is ranking for it, and a few other things. And you find some good candidates, and then you select 3 to 5 keywords for each page. So you select, you say like, okay, this keyword's got some good search volume around it. It's not super high competition, and it's exactly what our page talks about. So we're going to use this keyword on the page. So once you select those 3 to 5 keywords, then you will optimize the page for those keywords by updating the metadata of the page, which basically anytime you Google anything, like when it ranks in the SERPs, you're going to see a blue like link at the top, and that's called the title tag. And then underneath that, you're going to read a description, a quick description of the site, and that's called the meta description. So that's the first place that we go to optimize for those keywords. And then the other major place that we go to is the content on the page, just making sure it has some robust, like compelling, readable content that also contains a few of those keywords. So that is related to the last question, which is about how many times should you repeat a keyword on a page. to get ranking, and there is no there's really no set rule about that. Um, you it's especially hard because every page is going to have a different length of content. For so like if I'm writing a description for like a category page on an e-commerce site, that's probably only going to have like 150 words of content, because all I want to do is just like introduce the category and share how cool it is. But blogs, on the other hand, I've written like 4,000 word blog posts without even like blinking. And so, so obviously, like mentioning a keyword a couple times in a 4,000 word blog post is going to be a lot easier than mentioning it a couple times in the content in 150 words. So there's no set rule, but I do try to get them all in there at least 1 or 2 times. And the nice thing is that as Google has gotten kind of more advanced in their understanding of keywords and search terms, they've started to learn that they don't need the exact keyword like all lined up next to each other. If you break it up, or if you use synonyms, or if you use like contextual words that they recognize, they'll still start to understand that you're talking about that keyword, even if you don't literally write the keyword. So that helps too. The question about burying keywords on white text on white backgrounds, that's actually a really fun thing to talk about, because we can talk kind of about the history of SEO and its relationship with Google. We as SEO strategists have always played a bit of a cat and mouse game with Google, where we're constantly figuring out how to manipulate stuff, and Google is constantly like, no, do not do that. And like learning how to actually like penalize people for doing this stuff. So the constant state of SEO is, and this is actually the way that I prefer as a writer, but the constant state of SEO is that it's very, very difficult to trick Google into ranking a page. You cannot do spammy things. You can't hide text. You can't go to Fiverr and pay someone $5 to send you 100 backlinks. You can't do any of that. The search engine is smart enough to know that that's a manipulative tactic, so it won't work. But like Leah mentioned, way back in the day when we graduated, like 2008, it still worked to do stuff like that, and it was a completely different industry back then. Like my job has gotten a lot more legitimate in the past. Probably the past like 8 years. Before that, I was kind of a Wild West. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I remember some of those Wild West days. And yeah, I remember even hearing terms like black hat SEO
Yeah.
and white hat SEO and all that stuff. There's a lot more questions about SEO, so I might see if we can come back to this towards the end of the session. But I want to make sure that we capture some from our live attendees today.
Mm-hmm.
And Maria asked, what is the most appealing thing about SEO as a writer? To me, it would be like, the prospect of making your work findable by a wider audience. And then
Mm-hmm.
Vivian has a similar question. As an SEO author, how do you show your work in a portfolio? Are you noted as the author? And I imagine that that is a little bit trickier.
Mm-hmm. It is. So my favorite part of SEO as a writer is the constraints that it puts on you. So I remember like back in school going through like writing exercises and poetry exercises and stuff, and like the professor wouldn't just be like, just write a poem. Like she'd be like, this is a ghazal or whatever, and it had like this certain amount of syllables, and it had a very fixed set of constraints, and it was really, really good practice to start to do all those different styles. And SEO is kind of the same way. Like it's a style. You have to be able to work keywords in a way that's very subtle and not like not super ham-fisted, like so that everybody rating it is like, oh, she just put an SEO keyword there. That's the only reason that she put that. So it's a challenge to kind of weave those in naturally. And then if you work for an agency and you're working with all these different businesses, it's also a challenge to learn on the fly and to learn well enough to, you know, speak about the subject with authority. There's also a fair amount of switching your voice depending on the client. Someone who's like B2B, business to business, or like industrial are obviously going to have like a different style and tone than someone who's selling to consumers, like a fashion brand. And so that's kind of fun too. Sometimes I feel like a little bit like an actor, and I get to like play all these different characters. And I'd say that's my favorite part as a writer is just learning how to be all these different things and learning how to like process this information that I don't know sometimes well enough to repeat it back in writing and at a level that's helpful for people. Yeah, I really like that.
Yeah, that's super
And
helpful. In our course, we've talked a lot about, when you're doing anything in terms of writing for digital spaces or writing in general, I think you really want to start with, focusing on your core audience, who you're trying to reach and how are you going to reach them. And I like what you talked about playing different roles or trying to get into their head, because I think that is a fun and creative part of it.
totally.
So with that, I want to take us into Q&A part 2, and we might speed this up a little bit, or we might just play it by ear. I tend to get overly ambitious with my own timings, but now it is time to switch our focus to content strategy. And the first question, I think, might be the hardest one, so let's start there. But how do you develop a content strategy? And a related question to this one is, how do I focus? I think there's too many areas to cover in my content strategy. And I really relate to that one. I think a lot of this can be really overwhelming, especially when we're new to it. So yes, I would love to hear from you on that.
Yeah. No, that is tough. And I mean, a lot of people don't realize that content strategy, in my opinion, is actually more specialized and more difficult than SEO. Because it's a part of SEO, but it's a world that you can really go a lot deeper into. And so that there is a way, there is like a formalized way to like develop a content strategy. But as someone who's just trying to put together something for your business, the thing that I would stress is that there's no wrong content strategy as long as you're producing content that is related to your brand and that you think your audience will love. And with the topics, with the narrowing down topics, that's also a tough question. I would try to narrow it down to, I would think in terms of like pillar topics and content that you can cluster around that. So I would try to narrow it down to like 5 major topics, if you can, that you think the brand has expertise in or wants to have expertise in. And then all of your related content, like every blog post you write after that, every piece you produce, try to connect it in somehow to one of those like core pillar topics, because that'll let you write about like more and more detailed stuff related to those main topics, but it will start reinforcing to Google that you that this is your area and that this is what you write a lot about. If I wish I I wish I had like a specific example of the type of business you're asking about, because I could maybe help you
Oh,
out.
yeah. We can maybe go into that one a little bit later. I do have some
Yeah.
questions about specific focuses.
Hmm.
But first, I'm going to be selfish and just ask my favorite question of the bunch. I'm
Hmm.
also asking because social storytelling is our topic for the week in writing for digital spaces. So
Hmm.
the question is, do you try to use storytelling in your content strategy or get straight to the point? And if you ask me, that doesn't have to be an either or question, but I want to hear from you, Meg.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I I am huge on storytelling. I always try to make sure that I'm telling a story in my content strategy. Um, that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be like a written story. It's not always going to have to be this like gigantic block of text. Sometimes the story that you can tell is visual, or sometimes you can tell it very succinctly with headers and bullet points and stuff like that. But yeah, I lean on storytelling in a major way. I don't think that people really connect to just random facts or random jargon. I, I think they need some sort of narrative thread, like even if it's just the smallest one. And I do make sure that that's built into everything that I produce. Um, I feel like I have so much to say about storytelling and I'm like blanking, but yeah, that is one of my favorite parts of content strategies, just figuring out all these different stories to tell, like both at the individual level, like with an individual page or blog post, but also like what is the story of the brand? Like who does the brand want to be? What values does it want to express, and what values does it want its customers to express, and like how can I get people to connect to those? So it's huge. It's a huge part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. May is asking a great question in the chat, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Please let me know if not. How do you show that you have the ability to design content strategies as they are somewhat generic and hard to grasp during job applications? So I think this is an important question not only for job applications, but Meg, when you prepare content strategies, I imagine that at some point you have to report back to the client how successful that strategy was. And a lot of that is about collecting metrics, numbers, data, which I myself am awful at. That's one area of growth for me. But I want to hear from you how you navigate that.
Yeah. I so I would say that like probably the one of the most difficult parts of content strategy is actually working with a client and trying to get them to understand what success looks like and how long it's going to take, because it is a successful strategy and it does, compound and build on itself over time, and it does so many important things that we can't quite measure accurately. We have substitutes, but like it plants seeds in people's minds, like sometimes years before they decide they even need the product. And how do you measure that? And so for me, it's a process of breaking things down, like taking a look at the conversion funnel. So you've got a funnel like this, and at the top, this widest part, you have awareness. So that's all of the people who are researching their pain point or their interest that's related to what your brand sells, that like may or may not even be thinking about like shopping or buying the product. Um, and then underneath that, you've got consideration, which is when they've decided, okay, I need this thing, so now I'm going to figure out who sells the best one for me. And then below that, you've got decision, which is they're very close to making their purchase, and they just need that extra push, like that extra bit of reassurance or incentive or offer. And so those three stages, they all have different metrics for success, because like if you're at the purchase stage, a, a conversion, which is basically a sale, completing a transaction, like that is your metric for success down there. But if you're up here at the awareness stage, you can't really expect like a lot of people to convert. And so it's a matter of kind of understanding what metrics you're looking for at each, like at awareness, like for example, I'm mostly just looking for organic traffic, and then how that traffic behaves once they read the post. And so if you understand like what metric you're looking for in each phase, that can kind of help you reinforce the success of your content strategy. And you can say like, right, this awareness content, it didn't make us any sales, but like it did increase our organic traffic by 30%. And I mean, we need to bring people into the funnel. Like if we don't bring people into the funnel, there is no funnel. So so that is important. So I think it's just a matter of like understanding what metrics to track for success, and just how like and understanding how to communicate that to somebody else so that they can see that is the correct way to measure that. I'm not sure if that directly answered the question, but
I think it's definitely getting there, and thank you so much. I know that's a tricky question too. I'm kind of eating into our time on the Q&A segment on professional writing, but I feel like I've got to ask this one because we wanted to get a more industry-specific one. And I also know that you have a lot of experience with this. So the last question that I want to ask on content strategy is, what advice do you have for a startup business, like, or a small business that is just starting to promote its own brand?
mm-hmm. I would say find your niche. You ideally you're going to be selling a product that isn't over highly saturated, but that's not always the case. And so like if you're in a competitive space, just find your audience. Like you can so for example, I have a little side business that I've been building for the past year and a half, that I hand make bath and body products, and but my business sells products that fit a full spectrum of sensory needs. So I have a processing disorder. So does my sister actually, and so it's sort of like so I've chosen an audience that I understand really well and can speak to, and it's taken me from like being another person who sells bath and body products to a person who has a fit and a community. And so so that's what I would emphasize for any startup e-commerce business, is to like find that one thing that makes you really unique, and or that group of people that you really want to connect with. And once you do that, like you can start to build content around that, and try to develop an expertise if you can. So instead of just writing a lot of like generic high level content, try to think about like what you want to become an expert in, and start producing that content. I think that helps a lot too, is becoming a resource for people, or a voice that they trust. That can really
Yeah.
help.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for sharing that. I've talked about several times in our course that, content strategy is about telling, not selling. And so
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it's really tough to spot content marketing because it's designed to be like valuable content and not
Yeah.
necessarily an ad.
Yeah.
So, pivot two questions on professional writing. And I'm going to start with my favorite question because I think it applies to anyone, right? And whatever we're writing for, wherever we're writing, why we're writing. How can I practice writing?
Man, that's such a good question.
Or maybe like to make it a little bit more specific to the MSPW program, what platforms can you advise to improve professional writing?
hmm. Well, I would I would definitely advise you to read like a writer. So read blogs that are within your industry. Find what those like authority resources are for your industry, and start reading and following blogs so that you can start to get an understanding of how people are writing about this stuff and like the type of content that people are connecting to and finding helpful, the format. And then for practice, I would say if you can set aside the same time every day to practice, that can be really helpful. I am more of a morning person than an afternoon person these days, which I never thought I'd say, but I am. So I have this 2 hour like window in the morning where I am at my most productive almost every single day. And I try to avoid scheduling like meetings or really anything else during that window, because I know that if I don't write during that window, I'm probably not going to be able to do it later. And so I think writing, probably more than people realize, writing is about energy management, not time management. So it's less about thinking of like, do I have the time to do this? When am I going to find the time to do it? And it's more about understanding your own like body's peaks and lows, and trying to make sure that you can practice every day when you're at a peak. And then the other thing I would advise is like, if you do end up in a job where you're blogging for somebody, or doing content strategy for someone, even if it's not the business that you started and that you're passionate about, even if it's like, I worked for a company that sold air purifiers for a while. Anytime you end up in a place like that, like, yeah, it's not the thing you're excited about maybe, but it's such a good place to practice. It's if you can make content like that creative and fun and interesting and constantly come up with new ideas about it, that that is a form of practice. So
Yeah, and
just
it's a good creative outlet, I think. And I'm glad that you mentioned the air purifier example because, I had to do the same thing in that first job.
mhm,
I had
mhm,
to write marketing and advertising programs about heaters and coolers and other things
yeah,
that like I still honestly don't understand. But it was really fun to figure out how to make it exciting. And I feel like
totally.
I've carried that on to every other job that I've had since then. Some of you
Mhm,
might know that I also do training on educational technologies such as Zoom and the university's learning management system. And these are sometimes like very dry topics. So
mhm,
to
mhm,
me, it's a great challenge to find, creative opportunities to get excited about that. Uh,
absolutely.
I want to ask one follow-up question about practicing writing, because you might not just be practicing for yourself, right? So what is one way that students can improve their writing and get it reviewed by professionals? And let's say that, we're talking about outside of class writing experiences, because you
Mhm.
always have your instructor for help in class.
Right, right. Yeah, actually, like, probably one of the biggest challenges of my career has been finding um, finding people who I work with who are at a high enough level to help me. And I know that sounds arrogant, but it's, you guys are gonna find this too. It's, if if you can write, it's sometimes hard to find someone who is capable of who writes at a high enough level to like to judge good writing. Just because it's a very rare skill. And so I've had trouble with that in my career. What I would say is, don't ever be afraid to ask people for mentorship, or if they'll look over something, particularly when you're still a student and you kind of have that angle on your side. But most people really, they like to help. They like to talk about themselves. They like to feel like the expert. That's something that makes them feel good. Like when Clea asked me to like come to this class, I felt good. And so I I would, yeah, that's, I would advise, just don't be afraid to like reach out if someone's working in your industry that you want to be part of, or writes the way that you want to write. Just reach out and ask them some questions and try to start that conversation. Um, Other than that, yeah, once you will, so you'll probably, as you go through your career, you will start to encounter people whose, people you work closely with whose writing you respect, and hang on to those people, and use them for feedback whenever you can. Have I still have a Slack chat open with, 3 coworkers from a job that I had like 5 years ago, just because I really respect their abilities. And so it's definitely important to like create a network, whenever you can, related to your job or not.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really good advice. I'm even thinking about joining some sort of informal writing group for professional writing about higher education. I have literally no free time, so that's the only reason I haven't jumped on board. But I would encourage all of you to seek out those like specific communities, because writers, they are all happy to support one another.
Mhm.
Um, and being around, those like-minded folks are going to help you do your best work. I want to ask one last question, and just again remind folks to ask any other questions. We probably have time for one more in the chat, but I love this one because I thought it was so sweet. One person who registered said, "What are you reading for fun or business?"
I love that question too. Well, so for for business, there's one book I recommended in the resource section that I'll just talk a little bit about now, because it's like my all-time favorite, like life-changing writing book. It's called "Do I Make Myself Clear?" Um, I think technically there's like a colon after that, and then it's like writing for the blah blah blah. But like, do I make myself clear? And that is about, it's about, the message is really important. It's basically about like, not, a lot of people think that they should use words to like impress or to obscure. A lot of people in my industry do this all the time. They just invent buzzwords, like just because they think it's impressive. And like this book really helps you. It helps you understand like what is important about good writing, which is how well you communicate the message and how clearly do you do that. And it helps you just sort of cut through all the noise and get back to like that very fundamental, um, am I writing this in a way that my audience understands? Because like, the burden is not on them to understand you. The burden is on you to be understood. And so it's very, for, I don't know, just read it, you'll love it.
Awesome.
And
I
then
definitely will. That sounds like a really important book, and I haven't heard of it yet, so I need to check that out ASAP.
it's super good. The other book that I'm reading for fun right now is called Sapiens, and it's basically like a history of the human species. Um, and there's like a really, really cool part about storytelling in that too, and the role that storytelling played um, in us evolving as humans. It pretty much is the entire reason that we like evolved to where we are now, because other animals have languages, but what they don't have is this ability to, join under a cause, and to communicate abstract concepts to someone they've never even met before. That's unique to us. So that's a really cool book to read
Yeah,
too.
that's really interesting. I would actually argue that I think my cats are excellent storytellers. They've got some kind of they're magic. They figured it out. And I do want to ask this one last question from Kay Bolin in the chat, but before we do that, I want to make sure that I don't miss out by talking about the resources that you shared. So again, everyone's going to receive the slides later this afternoon, so you can jump in on these links. I want to point out that Meg is being super generous with her time. She added a link to her LinkedIn profile as well as her email address. So if you want to reach out and ask any follow-up questions, I know we had so many questions pouring in today and we didn't get to all of them, but I hope that we got to some highlights and that you all got something out of this. And there's a lot of great resources here just for more about blogging, about SEO. You can read, the blog where Meg is working right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so the last question here was, people talk a lot about storytelling, but do they mean telling archetypical stories like rags to riches, Odyssey? It's a good question because storytelling can mean so many different things.
Yeah, it really can. Yeah, you know what? Like, marketing and content strategy is a place where I'm not really afraid of cliches. And archetypes is a nicer way to say that. Giving people something familiar, something that they, like an archetype that they know, like Goliath versus David. Or is that it? David versus Goliath? I don't know. But like, archetypes that people really understand and connect to, or like the misfit archetype, or the, you know, I think those can be really, really good to tap into when you're thinking about your brand and its place in the world. And I mean, you're basically like, I'm super biased, but to me, the person who writes the story of the company is like the most important person there is, because without them, it's just another company like selling something that no one needs, you know? Like, it's very rare for businesses to like actually like change the world. And so figuring out the story that you want to tell about what they are doing and how they are helping, it's really important. And I think that tapping into different archetypes can be a really tidy way to accomplish that.
Wonderful. All right, and we are officially at 2 o'clock. I wish we could stay and chat forever. Thank you again so much for doing this. I'm going to stop the recording in a minute, and we'll stick around for maybe 5, 10 more minutes. But thank you all for joining, for tuning in if you're listening to this later. And thank you again, Meg, for doing this for our course. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. And guys, seriously, like I really enjoy talking about this stuff. And so if you do have any questions that you want to like email me or connect with me on LinkedIn, like I'm happy to answer them. So
Thank you.
yeah.